Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for stopping by. Today I've got over an hour of horror stories for your listening pleasure. But before we get to that, a horror story that's happening right now is the desolation caused by Hurricane Harvey. Many people have been left homeless with their whole lives uprooted and most things they own destroyed. And many of them are relying on charitable organizations and donations to get food and shelter. I've linked a GoFundMe page in the description of the video that will donate all proceedings to the disaster relief. Thank you. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was working in the third largest building on this planet for floor space. It was around 3 AM on a Sunday, and I was walking down an aisle in the middle of my department. At this time, the place was very nearly vacant, as it was a holiday weekend, and we had only myself and a skeleton crew of maintenance workers under my direction, working in another department, all of whom were males. As I'm walking by my office on the plant floor, the power goes out and the plant drops into the most absolute darkness that I have ever experienced. With the power gone, I hear the various machines spinning down to rest, and the silence becomes overwhelming relative to the background noise that I had gotten used to. The faint sounds of running water become evident in the moments after the blackout, whilst I began searching my pockets for my phone and the flashlight that it offered. As my hand found the phone, a scream erupted from somewhere nearby, muffled and distant. It was the kind of scream that you hear from a 5-year-old girl in her first haunted house, as the bloody clown steps around the corner and fires up the chainsaw. It startled me very badly, and I immediately dropped my phone onto the ground. The scream continued, a constantly fading note that seemed to be moving away from my position. Panicked and terrified, I fumble around the dirty floor for my phone, and found it seconds before the emergency lights lit the plant, with the eerie glow of yellow light. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I looked around me, muscles tense and ready to defend against whatever this was. I tried my radio a couple of times, before I realized that with the power outage, the digital frequencies were useless without the receivers up in the main office. I started to move through the various production lines to where I assumed the scream had originated. My mind was working furiously. I had no women in my crew tonight, and we were the only people allowed in the plant. So where had the scream come from? Details began to press into my mind that I had not noticed before. The apparent youth of the voice behind the scream made no sense, and it was a scream of pain, the kind that you cannot even attempt to control. It had faded away from my position gradually, and then trailed off as if she had run out of breath. As I stepped between two products, on one of the final assembly lines before a wide open space in the next department, the emergency lights dimmed, and the audible electricity buzz filled the space around me. Struggling to understand what was happening, my senses were again knocked askew when the normal plant lights blazed to life. This left spots across my vision for a moment, forcing me to raise my hand to shield my eyes. As the shadow crossed my vision, I saw it, or rather, I saw her, only for that moment. She stood there, hand outstretched towards me, a vague outline, partially hidden behind one of our products. Dark features were the only distinguishable characteristic that I can remember, as my reflex in that moment had been to blink against the bright lights, and after that, she was gone. To this day, I have no idea if what I saw was real, or if I had imagined it. No tales are told of the mysterious young woman in the repair hole, not by anyone but myself. No one knows of any deaths matching to her description in the area, or ghosts known to haunt the plant. Not a soul had heard a scream in the darkness, not before, during, or after those black pre-dawn minutes. Believe me, I tried to find someone, anyone with information that might explain what I saw, but all to no avail. I'm left wondering, with a memory more crisp than any photograph I've ever seen, of that young woman standing in the distance, her arm outstretched towards me. Needless to say, I did not revisit the same location of the event, ever, because nopes don't get any bigger than that. A few years ago, we had an apparent suicide, pedestrian versus train. Hispanic male in his early 20s, and he left a note and then decided to go take a nap on the tracks. It was a mess. I mean a real horror show of a mess. And anyone who's ever had to work a rail-grade collision knows that your investigation takes a back seat to getting the train moving again. So we are working like crazy to get everything in order so that we can release the train. Well, and this is the creepy part. The family claimed we missed something out there. Personal property of the deceased, I suppose. According to the mother and grandmother, this kid had a big, gaudy gold cross neck chain that he loved more than life itself. We searched for it high and low, and never found it. We even came back out with a K9 unit, and tried to pick it up, but still, no dice. At this point, it's just gone. Disappeared into thin air. Well, this guy's younger brother is a 17-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder. He goes out there at night a few hours after we'd cleaned up and decided to look for himself. Before he went out though, he told his friends and family that the cops were worthless and that we were not trying to help. I shit you not. You cannot make this stuff up. He gets hit by a different train in almost the same damn spot on the tracks. You could still see the bloodstains on the shale. So sure as hell we go out, and I'm not even kidding. We find this poor kid over 100 feet of tracks, and he's got the gold chain clutched in his hand. That's some Final Destination shit right there. I felt so sorry for the parents. During my last semester at college, I was assaulted by a football player for walking where he was trying to drive. Note, he was 325 pounds, whilst I was a mere 120. Whilst unconscious on the ground, I lived a different life. I met a wonderful young lady. She made my heart skip and my face red. I pursued her for months and dispatched a few jerk boyfriends before I finally won her over. After a 2-year relationship, we got married, and almost immediately she bore me a daughter. I had a great job, and my wife didn't have to work outside the house, When my daughter was 2, my wife bore me a son, and my son was the joy of my life. I would walk into his room every morning before I left for work and doted on him as well as my daughter. One day, though, while sitting on the couch, I noticed that the perspective of the lamp was odd, inverted almost. It was still in 3D, just wrong. It was a square lamp base, red with gold trim on 4 legs and a white, square shade. I was transfixed. I couldn't look away from it. I stayed up all night staring at it to the point that my wife got very concerned. That's when things started to happen. I didn't go to work. Something, I didn't know what, but something was not right with that lamp. I stopped eating. I only left the couch to use the bathroom at first. Soon, I stopped doing that too, as I wasn't eating nor drinking. I stared at that lamp for 3 days before my wife became extremely concerned. She had someone come over to try and talk to me. By this time, though, my cognizance was breaking up and my wife was freaking out. She took the kids to her mother's house just before I had my epiphany. The lamp was not real. My house was not real. My wife, my kids, none of it was real. The last 10 years of my life had not been real. The lamp started to grow wider and deeper. It was still inverted dimensions. It took up the entire perspective, and all I could see was red. I heard voices, screams, all kinds of weird noises, and then I became aware of pain. A shit ton of pain. The first words I said were, "I'm missing teeth." I opened my eyes. I was laying on my back on the sidewalk, surrounded by people that I did not know. Lots of them were freaking out, and I was completely confused. At some point, a cop scooped me up and walked me across the sidewalk and into the grass and threw me face down into the back of a car. I was still disoriented. I was taken to the hospital by the cop, as it seemed he didn't want to wait for the ambulance driver. I went through about 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving at the loss of my wife, my children, and dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared that I was going insane, and I would cry myself to sleep, hoping I would see her in my dreams, that I would blink, and I would wake up again in the reality that I once knew. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He is perpetually 5 years old, and I can never hear what he says. I have no idea what happened. Could I have dreamt it all? Could you dream 10 years of a whole life? A person, moments shared, places gone, new experiences, new tastes, new smells. Can it all come from your mind? Really? I don't think so. But like I said, I have no explanation for what happened that day, and it still leaves me speechless. Almost 2 years ago, I was a young female of 21 years old looking for some work to pay off for my student loan. Luckily for me, I found a job at a pharmacy in my downtown shopping mall. Me and a group of 10 others were tasked with transferring stock from the old store to their new location within the mall. The job was tedious, but considering that I was being paid for transporting cases of stock from their stockroom in the basement up to the new store upstairs, the work wasn't so bad. Well, With a tote box in hand that needed to be transferred upstairs, I, like everyone else, just used the freight elevator for convenience. The elevator, like all other freight elevators, was massive and was used by businesses within the mall to transport stock from their inventory to their stores. The elevator, being quite old, had graffiti etched into the walls and would creak and clang with it when it was operated. It was nearing the end of my shift one day, and not being very used to the eerie elevator, I entered with a bit of hesitation. I pressed the button to go up to the main door and had to pull down the top grate of the elevator, as it was common that it would get jammed, and did so at that moment. The elevator slowly started moving upwards, passing levels as it went by, which I could see through the little window of the door. It was not much later that the elevator came to a screeching halt at the 7th floor. The doors slowly opened, but the strangest part was that where I would have been waiting half expectantly for someone to have got on the elevator, there was no one. I peered out the elevator for a second, just to check if anyone had pressed the button requesting it, but no one was in sight on that floor. I thought it was a bit strange. Perhaps they got bored of waiting and had gone elsewhere. So I pressed the button to close the doors and continue to my floor. As the doors began to close though, a tall man with copper curly hair and a black puffy coat came bounding into the elevator with a huff. Being the kind girl that I am, I acknowledged him with a small smile and a nod, and moved to the far right of the elevator shaft, close to the control panel to give him space. I pressed the close door button more than once, and then the elevator continued upwards, not speaking to the strange man. I then began to notice him shuffling closer and closer to me. It was very strange. I gave him plenty of room and he was practically on the other end earlier. And yet, as the elevator slowly ascended, he felt the need to move closer to me. It was getting to the point that we were almost standing shoulder to shoulder. Then, he spoke in a very calm and low tone. "Today must be my lucky day. The elevator never stops on my floor. I never catch the elevator in time." Looking up at him and seeing the best in people, I laughed nervously and replied to him, "Yeah." It was at that point that it started to get freakishly close. It was almost as if we were chest to chest with nothing but a tote box separating us. It was in this moment that reality hit me. This man was making me feel very uncomfortable and was giving me a very creepy vibe. My heart began to pound in my chest as the reality that I was in this scary elevator alone with this creepy man truly hit me. As I moved closer to the wall, as he crept into my personal space, I began to think about what I could use to defend myself if he began attacking me. The only weapon or tool that I had was this tote box. It was very flimsy, and it was just a barrier between him and I. I glanced at the control panel and watched as the numbers of the floor levels changed painstakingly slow. I prayed that we would reach my floor soon, as I was afraid that he was going to do something terrible to me. The man just stared maniacally into my soul, as if contemplating what to do to me. My entire body began to shake, and my heart felt as if it would burst out my chest. I was just so scared. Just as soon as I accepted the situation and prepared myself to fight back, the elevator screeched to a stop on my floor, The doors slowly creaked open to 4 individuals waiting to enter. I let out a breath that I had been holding in the entire ride, as I was so relieved to see other people. One young woman glanced down at me on the elevator as it opened, and looked at the man and smiled and said, "Hey, how are you?" And the creepy man reacted like a switch had been turned off inside him, smiled back excitedly and responded, "Hey." It was at that point that the group entered the elevator, and I took the opportunity to bolt out the doors and back to the pharmacy. When I got home, I felt shaky and terrified. I could not get the image of this man's creepy smile out of my head. I didn't want to after that day, but I remained at the job as I desperately needed the money. But I never went into the elevator alone, and I always carried an X-Acto knife in my pocket just to be safe. But I never did see that man again. There have been several assaults in the downtown area since then, and whenever I would hear these stories, I would always wonder to myself if these were ever connected, in part, to that man with the curly hair and the creepiest smile. This story takes place in August of 2013, in the mountains of South Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman, in other words, a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go exploring some back roads and get out of the heat in town. South Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days searching on roads that we knew, finding roads that we did not, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road that we'd never been on before and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of any other people in the woods. We rounded a bend into the thick fir woods and emerged into a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noises, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5", but regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed that he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of colour that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet away from this strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread hit me, and felt certain that there was someone in that tent, and if we could see the tent, they could undoubtedly see us. There were no campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remote would be, well, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement, nor hear any strange sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" There was no reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it just the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the campsite, should there be any need to leave in a hurry. He would be waiting at the wheel. My heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, and no wood collected. The tent, oh the tent, it was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave to tell Nick what I had seen. As soon as I left, I heard Nick begin to yell, "Let's go, let's get out of here!" Not knowing what he was yelling about, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, and the third person was laying against the window of the back seat. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way that we'd come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from the trooper, stating that the campsite and the backpacks and all the women's clothing was gone, though he could tell that people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove, and I have not returned to the area, and do not have any intention of doing so again. From May 2010 to May 2011, I worked as a security guard at a hydroelectric dam in Virginia. It was a fairly isolated location. If you needed an ambulance, you could expect at least a 20-minute wait. About a month after I was hired, one of the guys at the dam told me that most security guards out there will quit after a few days because they got so creeped out by being alone in the dam all night, and he was glad that I was sticking to it. In truth, it could be very creepy. Sometimes at night whilst I was patrolling the basement levels of the dam itself, I would think about the fact that I was 50 feet below the waterline on the low side, and the only human being in about a 1.5 mile radius. Sometimes, I'd hear weird noises in the woods, or catch a flash of a shadow whilst I was in the dam. It does take a lot to scare me though, and I knew that I was either hearing critters in the woods or my mind was playing tricks on me. One night, however, something happened that scared the living hell out of me. It was a little past 11 p.m, and I was sitting in the guardhouse reading a book. Suddenly, I hear a tap at the door. What's creepy about the guardhouse at night, though, is that you have a little lamp inside turned on. People could look through the window and see you quite clearly, but due to the glare off the glass, it made it difficult for you to see outside. When I heard the tap at the door, I thought it was a bug hitting the glass. It was so faint, and I knew that there weren't any contractors at the dam. I had the place to myself. The tap came once again, more insistent this time. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. There was no one there. I let the door slip from my hand and shut behind me. To my left, previously concealed by the door as I had opened it, was a huge man, at least 400 pounds, wearing a grey sweatshirt and grey sweatpants, and the sweatshirt was smeared with fresh blood. My heart started hammering, and my blood ran cold. I was so scared I could barely speak. As it turns out though, he was a local fisherman who had been fishing off the bridges over the trail race, and he was wondering why the power company hadn't started back pumping into the lake yet, because they usually started a little before 11, and that's when he always drew in the big striped bass. He was smeared with blood because he'd already caught and gutted a couple and wiped his hands on his shirt. He felt really bad when he realised that he'd approached me basically in the same way that a murderer in a horror movie would have. I am thankful to this day that I am an unarmed security guard, because if I'd have had a gun, I would have either shot him or accidentally shot myself whilst trying to shoot him. This happened a couple of years ago in my neighbourhood. An elderly neighbour thought that one of the strays that she regularly fed was in the backyard of a vacant house next to her backyard. I told her that I would go look, as she was very anxious about it and worried a lot of the time. I was on my cell phone, and she was on her home phone. The house next door to the vacant house had a radio on the garage. People were working on the car, birds were chirping, and you could hear kids down the street. She's at her back door, and we can see each other as I walk along the side of the vacant house. I call the cat's name and saw nothing move, and was relaying this to her as I walked further into the backyard. But then all of a sudden, something happened. I could no longer hear the radio next door, nor the people, nor the children, nor the birds. The phone became very staticky, and when I looked over to her back door, it was like a mist. I could hardly see her. I yelled into the phone, "Can you hear me?" And in reply, a man's voice said, "Help me." I flew out of that backyard. I stopped a few houses up to catch my breath. I could hear the radio people and birds and kids again. The phone was no longer staticky. She said over the line, "What the hell was that?" I relayed what I had seen and heard, and asked her what she saw and if she had heard me. She told me that for a moment her vision was obscured, almost as if I were in a cloud, and she heard static on the phone. Then she heard the voice of a little girl. I asked if she was sure it was a little girl, and she said it was. Nothing has ever terrified me more than that. We have a 90-year-old neighbour and has lived in this neighbourhood ever since it had been built. I went over and asked her if anything had happened in the backyard or in that house in general. She knew and had never heard of anything. I told her what happened, and she thought maybe it had something to do with the Indians that lived on this area several hundred years ago. There is no amount of money that would ever entice me to go into that yard again, and I shudder to even look at it. When the house was torn down, the neighbourhood shook more than for any other house. In the year 1972, my younger sister and I were forced to move from our home in Norway to go live in the UK. My mother had just married an Englishman who had 4 children of his own, and they were expecting another one. It was a miserable time for me, because at 6 years old, I had not begun school yet in Norway, so consequently I spoke no English. I had also been forced to leave my father and beloved grandparents behind, and my own mother was more interested in her new husband than any of her children. My childhood was the unhappiest time of my life, and this was only exasperated by the experiences in the manor house in which we moved to. The old manor house was situated in a seaside town. From the outside, it was the picture postcard of the British countryside. A large lawn surrounding the driveway leading to the house. A glass greenhouse, stables around the back, and horses in the paddock. But behind this facade, we experienced such horrors, some that I still struggle to talk about to this day. Us children all experienced paranormal activity, particularly at night, and it left us exhausted. Our parents were not particularly concerned and often shut us out. All we had were each other, and it was terrifying. You dreaded sleep and the activity that would come with it. I would sleep with my dog and cat on the bed, but even they could not bring me enough comfort. One night, when I was around 9 years old, I was awoken by my dog standing near the bedroom window growling. The cat was standing with her back arched and fur standing on end, hissing loudly. All of a sudden, though, my dog whimpered, and then suddenly there was silence. The room went cold, and the darkness seemed to engulf us. I got out of my bed shaking in fear and crept towards my bedroom window, where my dog was now crouching, ears pinned down to her head. The floorboards creaked under my weight. As I reached the blacked-out curtains, I peeked out to see if there was an animal in the front yard that could have startled the cat or dog. But I saw nothing. I craned my neck and looked beyond the greenhouse. Again, there was nothing. I sighed. I took a step back and went to draw the curtain. But then, suddenly, everything happened at once. The dog started barking ferociously and frothing at the mouth, and my bedroom door swung open and slammed hard against the wall. My posters then flew off the walls. I turned back to the window and I saw the face of a man smiling menacingly at me. Terrified, I spun around expecting to see someone who stood behind me. But when I did, there was no one there. I turned back to the window and it was gone. All that was left was the fog imprint from the outside of the window, as if someone had had their face pressed up against it and was looking in. My room was on the second floor, and no one could have reached that far without a ladder. Since that day, I have never forgotten that face. But the activity continued. I would wake up nearly every morning with my posters littered all over the floor, and would spend the first part of my day pinning them back up. It was relentless. My parents never believed me, but after months of torment, I refused to leave my mother's bed at night. It was then when my stepfather was forced to sleep in my bedroom for a night, and only after he experienced it for himself did he believe me. When he woke up in the morning, all of my posters were laying skewed on top of him. Despite all of this, there was one thing that did bring me comfort during my miserable childhood. I always missed my family in Norway dearly and cried myself to sleep most nights. But then one night, I felt a light touch brush beside my hair from my face. This simple and intimate action brought me so much comfort. I opened my eyes and saw an older woman sitting beside me. She had grey hair swept back into a tight bun, and now reflecting on the clothes that she wore, I suspect that she was once a maid or the head of the house. After all, this was a very old large manor house. She would visit me often, and always brought this feeling of familiarity and comfort. Although I knew that she wasn't alive like you or I did feel that she kept me safe from the man that I saw at my window. I was not the only child in that house to have a paranormal experience either. My younger sister Ella shared a room with our stepsister Marie, and she would awake nightly with fits of terror and sweat, and she would often come into my room and curl up in my bed, frightened with me. I only had a small single bed, and with a dog, cat, and now her kittens, it became too much to have her in my bed with me. So one night, when the usual routine of night terrors and her crawling into my bed had occurred, I told her to go to our mother's bed instead, insisting that I would take her there. I held her hand, and we left my room and went onto the landing. My mother and stepfather's room was at the very end of the hallway, and right next to it, there was a very large Victorian mirror. We could see our reflections as we crept along the corridor, and were careful not to wake up our sleeping siblings. Then suddenly, Ella stopped, frozen. I looked down at her and tugged her arm. Unresponsive, she stared ahead at the mirror. My heart sank and I became overwhelmed with a feeling of dread. Slowly I looked up. There in the mirror, we saw the back of a maid pushing a service trolley. She was moving towards us. We belted back to my room and hid under the quilt. We heard the squeaking of wheels pass us and stop. We didn't dare to look, and we stayed there until morning. I will never forget these events. So, as a kid I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town, at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently saw all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes, and cats. Our property and a bunch of other neighbors' properties bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to gate about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we are the only people up there, as all the other homes are hunting cabins, long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such, so anyone wanting for off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother and sister and I pull up to the gate, and we cannot find the key. It's gone. So one of us, i.e. me, has to walk all the way back up to the house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark. And with the new snow, you can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky, on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while. But it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First you walk through around 200 meters of trees, then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which on the other side of is our house. I set out and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched as I'm halfway through the first meadow. That deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you, and you can't see what it is, made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it, so I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen, as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well, so I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So second clearing comes up and I know what the plan is, and I am about to book it. Thankfully, I'm familiar with what to do, and I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12 gauge first and the keys second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. It actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon. A few years ago, I got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but he never returned. And this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in the neighbouring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed that he was staying at the other house and claimed that he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they had recently got into a fight about finances, and that he agreed that he was bad at money, and maybe that they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going to. The son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old, abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there, either thinking about doing it or already acted out the suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some sign of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road about an hour after, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how unreliable they were, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I travelled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with way too few police officers. Nonetheless though, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about 3/4 of the way down, I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough, my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I'd found the truck, parked my vehicle, and travelled the 20 feet to his truck, with my heart beating like I was doing a sprint rather than a normal run. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood, caused by a self-inflicted gunshot wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about this gut feeling whilst travelling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene. Having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family who was expecting good news to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. I sold a car, but I didn't. When I was younger, I owned an old Falcon coupe, which I always meant to do up. But life got ahead of me as it does, and I sold it. I also kept in contact with the guy who bought it. We spoke for a while as he gradually worked on it, and got it looking pretty nice. Years later, when my parents were cleaning up their property out of town, my mother asked me what I wanted to do with my old coupe. That made no sense, and still doesn't, after telling her that if there's one on the property, it wasn't mine. When I went to visit them, sure enough, there's my old coupe, in the exact same state as when I had sold it. Buried up to its axles in dirt, having sat there for more than a decade. All this time I'd regretted having to sell it, wishing I could find another one, because they were really rare, and apparently my memories of selling it come from a different universe, but the fact of selling it came from this one. I am absolutely certain I sold it to this guy. He also went to great length to tell me all the details and problems he had and all the new parts that he had to get imported to get it running again. I am absolutely certain I sold it to this guy, because we had such extensive conversations about the recovery process. Still freaks me out to this day. Some family friends of mine were looking into buying a new house and moving in together since they had been dating for a few years now. They found a house that was in their price range and in a good location, so they contacted the local estate agent and arranged to meet him in front of the house one morning to look around it. When they arrived though, there was no sign of the estate agent's car, but they decided to knock on the door anyway in case he was waiting inside. After knocking, a small old woman opened the door and looked at them expectantly. "Oh, we're sorry. We didn't know that anyone else was looking at the house today. Is it alright if we come in?" they asked. The lady didn't respond. She just stood to one side to allow them to come in. The whole time that they were looking around, the old lady would always stay in the same room as them and appeared to be looking at them more than at the house. After they had finished looking at the property, they walked out of the door, and as they were approaching their car, they saw the estate agent pull up beside them. The estate agent asked if they were ready to see the house and apologized for the delay. And then they replied that they'd already seen the house and that they'd been looking at it with the old lady as well. The agent looked at them perplexed and said that no one else was scheduled to look at the house today and that he had the only key to the door. They led him to the porch and tried opening the door to show him that he was mistaken, only to find it locked. They didn't buy the house. I worked as a night auditor at this semi-swanky hotel next to the airport. One night, I get a call from a lady in 204. She says that she was hearing arguing, loud banging, and crying coming out of 206. I checked the computer, and no one is checked into that room due to maintenance issues. I'm a little bit confused, so I called my supervisor to see what she would have me do, and she tells me to call on-site security and follow them up with a key. As we're approaching on the elevator, we can hear the crying. It's loud. My heart begins racing as we're near the door. So I hand the key to the security guard, and the next 5 minutes seem to happen in slow motion. He opened the door and immediately flicks on the light. Keep in mind, we're only on the second floor, and the only door was by me. And it was about 3 a.m, and there was no one around. As we enter, the shower is on, and steam is coming out from under the door. There is only one lamp on in the room, and it is very cold. There is a lady in a red lacy bra and panties, super red curly hair, curled up on the bed crying. She was facing away from us. As Frank approached her, he asked her if everything was okay. She sort of stopped crying and rolled over. When she did, a wave of horror came over me. She was very pale and covered in blood, and was just staring behind us. That's when we realized that the shower had stopped, and that the toilet door was open. There was a man about 6'5" standing in the doorway. We turned around just in time to see the cops tase him and arrested him. I was so grateful that my supervisor called the cops as well. It turned out that he was a rapist who hides in hotel rooms, kidnaps women who stay there, and decides to cut them open. The woman was okay, but to this day, I will never go to a hotel again. Once, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was on a road trip with my family. We had had a wonderful vacation in Disney World for a week, and we were driving back home to Houston from Orlando. I'd fallen asleep in the back seat, and I have no idea how long I'd been asleep for. Whilst I was asleep, I remember having the most vivid dream of burning alive. It was so hot, and I felt the fire burning me alive. I could hear it crackling. I could hear a faint screaming. I could even smell and taste the smoke in my dreams. I awoke startled when my mum had to slam on the brakes pretty hard. I woke up sweaty and very anxious. There was something off, and I could just feel it in the pit of my stomach. I asked my mother why she slammed on the brakes, and she just said something about traffic starting randomly on the freeway. We were in a slow, bumper-to-bumper traffic jam for about 10 minutes, which was enough to let me catch my breath and reflect upon the dream I had just had, to tell my family what I'd seen. We came up to the place that defined why there was a random traffic incident. A car had slammed onto the pillar of the overpass and was entirely engulfed in flames. No ambulance, no fire truck, and no police had arrived yet. Just Samaritans pulled over trying to help whoever was inside. Immediately I knew they weren't alive, and I had just been experiencing what they were. I burst into tears. Never will I forget it. I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long-dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight and freaked out the adult leaders and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people, and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow, and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears, and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch, you're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau, just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day, we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange, because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night, except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent, there were no trees anywhere. Just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch black objects, bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself. I worked as a park officer for a downtown metropolitan out of the Pacific Northwest. I saw my fair share of weird stuff on the night shift. Naked bike ride party after midnight with about 1,000 or so naked people chilling out, the occasional couple having sex, homeless people jerking off or shooting up heroin, and the occasional dead body. They were all a normal part of my job. Anyway, this one night, we were sent to investigate a tent set up relatively near the waterfront, which was generally a homeless person that was trying to stay dry for the night. So we get there around 11:30 and tell the lady inside that she has to go a few hundred yards away to an area that is not patrolled. She fusses and complains about having to move, and then mentioned about a man living in a cave at the bottom of a shallow ravine, and that he had been killing small animals and eating them. We ask her for more information, and she points to a general area about 50 yards away through some thick brush. The general area that most people won't wander past. My partner and I started to walk through the thick brush with just our flashlights, and eventually stumbled upon the ravine. And sure enough, there is a small opening on the side, enough for a person to fit in. I scale down about 20 feet and peek inside the opening and see what seems to be a massive pile of magazines, torn pages, articles of clothing, a sugar cookie tin, a gorilla costume hand, some crude looking tools including a makeshift bow, a few knives, and other generally weird shit. Being curious, and given that the cave was empty, I opened the sugar cookie tin and found a large amount of what seemed to be raw animal meat. At this point, I was thoroughly freaked out and decided to leave the area and inform the police of what I had found. We never found out what came of the guy who was staying there or what he was doing, but it was definitely freaky at around midnight in pitch black conditions. My parents used to live in a different house before I was born. It was a very old house, rather cold and drafty and creaky like most houses are. But one night, something very strange happened to my mother. My dad had gone out with his friends one evening, leaving my mother home alone. It was around 9:30, and my mum hears a car pull up into the driveway and sees the lights flashing into the house. She finds it very strange. It was a very early time for my dad to get home. She thought maybe he decided to come home early for some reason, but became more freaked out when the light to the laundry room, where the back door leads to, turned on by itself, and she swore she could see the outline of someone inside that room from underneath the door. It was at that moment that her cat started hissing and growling at the door, which was very unusual since she wouldn't hiss at anyone she didn't know. It was beginning to grow incredibly tense, and after a minute or so, my mum decided to open the door to see what was going on, only to find the room completely empty with the light on. The only way to turn on that light is from the inside of that room. She stood there confused, and then went to have a look at the car in the driveway as no one had opened the front door. There was no one there, and there was no way a car could have got out without making a sound. She still has no idea what it could have been. About 5 years ago, my friend and I were leaving Newton Falls, Ohio, after the 4th of July fireworks. We headed towards Akron, which was about 45 minutes away. A short bit outside of town, we passed state troopers in an area and a motorcycle on its side, with a body covered. There was suddenly a rolling mist that was coming off the surrounding fields. It hadn't been foggy or misty before, not until we passed that fatality, and even with high beams, it seemed like we were driving through thick pea soup mist. I saw a road sign that we had to basically stop to see. The name was not familiar at all. My friend's PT Cruiser said that we were going fine, but the road wasn't familiar. The mist kept rolling off the fields. No other cars were around, and we drove for over an hour, and still stayed in the same area as it seemed, with winding roads and the mist rolling around us. It was starting to get very creepy. It didn't help that I had no internet coverage on my cell phone, so I text posted to Facebook and asked if anyone was up to please call me and bring up Google Maps so they could try and help us so that we could find out where we were, as we were very, very lost. A few minutes later I get a call. We were driving very slowly, and I gave them the name of the road sign. They couldn't find it on the map. They even searched for it and nothing came up. The longer we spoke, the more the mist started to dissipate. Suddenly, when the mist cleared, we were in Rootstown. However, this made no sense at all, as to get there, we would have had to have gone under I-76, which is what we had been trying to do. We had been driving slow enough to catch sign reflections, and there were no signs for the 76. My friend on the phone said that there was no way we could have gotten there without going under the 76 or seeing exit or entrance ramps. Well, we did, and there were also now vehicles around us. We took a road through Rootstown 18 to Akron. And what did we pass in Rootstown? State troopers, a motorcycle on its side, and a body covered. When I tried to find information on the Newton Falls accident, I couldn't find anything in the following days, nor the accident that we saw in Rootstown. I have no idea what we might have entered, but I believe having someone call me managed to get us out of it. I am a biologist, and one of the perks of the job is being able to see some remote and spectacular places that people don't often see. Part of my work involves collecting insects from remote watering holes out in the middle of Australia, a few 100 kilometers north of Uluru. One of the ladies I work with, Alice, lives out there full time and spends a lot of her time in the bush, as well as with the local Aboriginal people. She has a trove of stories and weird experiences, but I just thought I'd tell you about the one that I had. So, as I said, I visit a lot of waterholes out there. Being a very arid region, these waterholes hold great spiritual and cultural significance to the indigenous people. Most, if not all of them, are scared in some way, and they have all traditional stories attached to them. So one day, 4 of us are heading out to this particular site. A full day of heavy 4-wheel driving through the Finke Gorge. When we get there not long before sundown, as we pull up there is a black dingo standing in the spot that we are going to camp. He stares at us for a bit, then disappears off into the bush. This is normal, they always do that, and isn't weird in itself. There are plenty of dingoes out there and they come in a wide range of colours. It's not that common to see a black one around there, but it's fine. We set up camp and have a nice night looking for pythons and drinking wine. We slept in swags, kind of like tents that just fit in a sleeping bag, and sometimes has a little fold-up netting so that you can sit up in there. It was really windy that night, so no problems with spooky noises, and I went to sleep pretty quickly. That night, though, is when I had it. The extremely vivid dream about the black dingo coming into camp. It was sniffing around my swag and scratching at the netting as if it were trying to get in. The dream bothered me, and I woke up and went back to sleep pretty soon after. Still, not so weird. We woke up in the morning, did our sampling, packed up camp and started off back on the long drive to town. After we'd been driving for a bit, Alice starts talking about how seeing the black dingo at the campsite yesterday really freaked her out. She didn't say anything earlier because she didn't want to spook us, but it turns out that in the traditional folklore, the waterhole is protected by a black dingo spirit. The last time Alice camped out there with other people, one of them had a dream that a black dingo came up to their swag, managed to get in, and began attacking her. This lady woke up in a panic, with long, deep scratches all over her face, and no reasonable explanation for how they got there. I had no idea about this story before I had my dream, and I didn't even mention it to anyone that morning. There is definitely a special feeling to a lot of these places. It's very hard to describe, but when you're out in the country, these kinds of weird semi-spiritual coincidences are commonplace. I'm just very glad that nothing bad came from mine. This happened when I was interning with the Sheriff's Police Department, so most of my time was spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there, and we are met by the neighbours, who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox, and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. So we go up to the house, and the front of the door is unsecured. So we crack open the door a couple of inches, and the deputy calls inside. But the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs met at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset. So we concluded that there might be objects behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder, and that it could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the window, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and we looked in and noticed bags upon bags of garbage, diapers and miscellaneous stuff all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open this time with a lot more force than before, and then from underneath I see a grease liquid oozing out from underneath the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she must have been gone for about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor. And her face was all black and had been for the most part eaten to the bone by maggots. I will never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit is not enough. The thing that really got to me though was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. As I said at the start of the video, there's a link if you'd like to donate to the disaster relief for Hurricane Harvey, and you'll be able to find it in the description. Any amount would be very much appreciated to help all of those affected in these troubled times. If you enjoyed today's video, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to not miss your daily dose of horror. And there's also a magical button that you could press right next to subscribe, shaped like a bell, to join an elite club. If you want to know what it's about, you'll need to press it. Remember that you can submit your scary or paranormal story to my new official Reddit page, or send it over to my email, both of which can be found in the description. And feel free to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at The Mortis Media for sneak peeks into what goes on behind the scenes. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.